can see your dirty pillows. Everyone will.
They're called breasts, lady. Welcome to the Final Girls podcast, where we do not call breasts dirty pillows. I'm Anna Bogutska, co-founder of the Final Girls Collective and your podcast host. If you're new to the show, welcome. In real life, the Final Girls put on events and screenings that explore the intersections of horror film and feminism. And on this show, we take a horror trope, rip it apart, rummage around in its thematic entrails, and figure out why it works, does it hold up, and what it says about wider horror culture. That's a lot of stuff to say that basically we talk about horror movies in depth. In this fourth series of the podcast, we're looking at teen horror, how it's evolved, and why teenagers, and especially teenage girls, make some of the most compelling protagonists in the genre. Before we dive into our film this week, a quick reminder, you can follow us on Twitter and Instagram at The Final Girls UK for updates, event announcements, and horror memes. We also have a Patreon where you can support our work if you so choose to and are so inclined, and we do post occasional bonus episodes over there. We kicked off our teen horror season with the super influential Texas Chainsaw Massacre, which is now, we've decided, canonically a teen horror film. And today we're revisiting Carrie, the 1976 first big screen adaptation of Stephen King's novel, directed by a personal favorite, the macabre maestro of horny horror cinema, Mr. Brian De Palma.
It's the night of the senior prom. The Bates High School gym is alive with excitement. Everybody is there, even Carrie White, the girl no one likes.
Oh, sorry about this incident, Cassie.
It's Carrie!
And everyone makes fun of her.
Free Carrie!
The girl who lives in that creepy house with her crazy mother.
Help the sinning woman see the sin of her days and ways. Show her that if she had remained sinless, the curse of blood would never have come on her.
The girl with the strange power.
If I concentrate hard enough, I can move things.
This is an episode we actually recorded last year as part of our Female Monster series, which of course you should totally revisit. But we can't have a teen horror series without Carrie, so I've revisited the episode, re-edited it slightly, and am reposting it for today's episode. This is a film that has meant a lot to me personally and is as problematic in many ways as it is a rich, layered text. Carrie is as much a horror film about a shy girl with supernatural powers as it is a portrayal of bullying, repression, emotional abuse, teen girl dynamics, and high school politics that take a terrifying turn when our protagonist discovers that she has telekinetic powers that she can barely control. Like any good teen movie, things end at prom. If you're new to the show and have never seen Carrie before, please know we spoil everything pretty much from the beginning, and I really encourage you to check out Carrie. I wish I could go back and see it for the first time all over again. Joining me on this episode is the super smart film critic Dr. Kelly Weston, who is as much of a Stephen King fan as I am, and we talk in depth about the themes and the legacy of Carrie, as well as briefly touching on the comparisons to the novel that inspired it too. And with all of that said, please enjoy our take on Carrie. Welcome back, Kelly.
Thank you for having me back.
So we've got a lot to talk about with this film. So let's just dive straight in. When did you first watch Carrie?
So my arrival to Carrie was very belated, actually. I was a huge fan of Stephen King adaptations from day. I think, I grew up on films like Cujo. Cujo is responsible for probably like 60% of my fear of dogs and and Dolores Claiborne. But I had never really seen Carrie, and one of the reasons for that is like we'll get into it probably as we discuss this film. I love horror, but I do tend to, or I did tend to draw the line when I was younger at like devil shit. Yeah, so I was not crazy about possessions or any sort of thing like that, and that was how I thought. That's how I framed Carrie in my head, having never seen it. And then I ended up having to do actually. I think it was around the time that I was like interning with Sight and Sound or for the BFI. I don't know if you remember this, but that was like one of the first panels that we did together was the Stephen King panel. This was
I remember
ages.
this, Kelly.
Yes.
Of course I remember. That's how we met.
I thought we met at the BFI before at something else that we did. I remember our first conversation, but I didn't know if this was the first thing that we'd ever done together, the first event. Ended up watching Carrie for that event. That was the first time I had seen it. I think I'd seen pretty much every Stephen King adaptation except that one. And it was, let me tell you, to to watch that film as an adult, it's absolutely wild because, some of its flourishes, its stylistic flourishes are very dated. They're very 70s. And, the gaze is very leering, but I don't know why, because obviously I had seen Brian De Palma films, but I was very surprised by how, for some reason, how overtly male the gaze was in this film.
Yes, that's definitely something we're going to talk about. So let's kind of place this within Brian De Palma's work.
Yeah.
Were you a fan of his work before? Kind of where does Carrie sit within it? You use the word leery, and you're so right. I just rewatched the film today, and I do not. I've seen it a whole bunch of times, and I've screened it a whole bunch of times. I do not remember when I first watched it as a teen, kind of just how lecherous the camera is from the very first scene.
I mean, it's filthy. It's like it is Carol Clover's essay, like, come to life. And fascinating. She doesn't really talk about Carrie that much, in her for the aptly named Her Body Himself, I think is what the essay is called. She talks about the ways in which horror sort of caters to a particular audience, a male, specifically male teenage audience. And she talks about, all of the different, gender boundaries that are sort of negotiated when you're watching horror films where women are victims, but then you also root for women. And, the thing about Carrie is like, again, it's very twofold because you're obviously feeling very sympathetic for her. She is, I guess, to borrow a very trendy term, she's an anti-hero, an anti-heroine, but you're also really invited to, to gaze upon her in this way that is very like, yeah, it's clearly sexualized, right? Like it's very pornographic. I had, as far as Brian De Palma is concerned, like I had seen bits of Scarface. I'm a Michelle Pfeiffer fan, so I'd seen all of the Michelle Pfeiffer scenes of Scarface. And I'd seen Body Double. I'd seen Dress to Kill, and I rewatched it for this. It's fascinating to like to think about, how those two particular films also sit in his work, because he does Carrie, and then I think Dress to Kill comes out in like 1980, 81 or something like that. And so they're like 4 or 5 years apart, and it's still very, they're both deeply gender text. They're both extremely, in their specific and distinct ways, very misogynistic. And at the same time, they're also, so sensationalized. Like they're really still very complex texts, I guess, to be more concise. Like there's like a lot to unpack. Yeah, that is my relationship generally with De Palma is grudging entertainment, grudgingly entertained.
I must admit, I grew up being a massive De Palma nerd. I loved Scarface. I loved Body Double. I loved Snake Eyes. So I got introduced because, yeah, I loved kind of this his very problematic brand of macho cinema, and the fact that he was obsessed with Hitchcock, and so was I, but he was going to places that Hitchcock could not go into visually just
Yeah.
because of the time in which they were making movies. And Carrie also I mean, all of his films have Hitchcock nods. Carrie in particular
Yeah.
also does. Carrie was also one of the second Stephen King book that I read as a teenage girl. And then I saw the adaptation, and I remember really empathizing with Carrie and not really focusing so much on the style. This time round, though, kind of rewatching it for the purposes of this podcast, it was interesting. There's two scenes in the film. There's the beginning, which is like in the shower scene, which is very, very softcore porny, basically.
Yeah.
It's a very lecherous camera. But then I was suddenly reminded kind of when it turns horrific. It's the horror of this naked girl who's just had her period and is just assaulted by all these other girls. That was the thing that I always remembered about the scene, and not so much the gaze of the camera, which I guess is weird to a degree. But then there's another scene which I was purely when the other teenage girls are being punished and they have to do high knees and do workouts with their gym teacher, and there's about 3 minutes worth of just a slow pan across all of their legs.
Yes, like ass, legs. But I mean, I was just those two scenes are so the two sequences that you point out are fascinating, right? Because we're talking about the ways that women are sort of configured as monstrous, and the thing that is so horrifying, or the thing that supposedly initiates Carrie into her powers, is her getting her first cycle, basically. Yeah, you're right. Like the camera, it's like, it's the camera's gliding through the locker room, and it's like doing all of these close-ups on boobs, and you watch Carrie sort of like massaging her body as well. So it almost seems as if she herself is, you catch her in the middle or about to masturbate. It's just a very odd scene.
Yeah.
And then it turns, and I don't mean this about periods, but the way that the scene is framed is almost violent. Like she sees the blood and she reacts in horror, and then the other girls react in horror. Yeah. And she, one of the things that I picked up on while I was watching it this time was like she keeps touching things that are white. She keeps touching Sue's white shirt, and she touches the teacher, I think Coach Collins, like she touches her white gym shorts, so that it just seems that much more vivid. And the thing that is, I mean, I guess, not to be a nerd about this, but I
mean, it's too late for that, Kelly.
I mean, true. She historically and mythologically, right, like the period is linked to women's powers, or to witchcraft, really, but like a kind of female and empowerment or sorcery that men are not privy to or unable to access. Just an aside, I've never felt more disempowered than when I'm on my period, but I just think like film of this period, like this is 1976, and then more recently, and I think these things are just based on like actual rituals probably, but do you remember the scene in Midsummer where she like she puts her menstrual blood in the drink or whatever to give to him? So those things are like, they're like passed down. But one of the things that I find really interesting about what you just said was, women are their bodies specifically are made monstrous, and they're also punished. Like the thing that you sort of think of Mrs. Collins as the more, I guess, benevolent version of Carrie's mother, Mrs. White, but actually they both are linked in the ways that they punish other girls, younger women, in a very corporal way. So Mrs. Collins does it where she sort of like makes the girls exercise until they are exhausted, and Carrie White's mother beats her and locks her in a cupboard. So yeah, in that way there's a weird through line. in this film about, you know, the body is this thing that women should be ashamed of.
Oh, totally. And it's interesting, kind of Mrs. Collins, because she actually slaps Carrie in that scene.
Yeah.
And I so zeroed in on the fact that when they're then in the principal's office, she kind of has this moment where she says, you know, oh, I also wanted to just hurt her. Like, I got why the girls were punishing her and torturing her, making fun of her. Like, there was something about Carrie that made her kind of, you know, someone that people wanted to hurt, which is such a weird and damaging aspect of this. But then there's also the way that Mrs. White, Carrie's mother, talks about bodies herself. You know, she calls her breasts dirty pillows, and she's so not just embarrassed by her own body, just by the fact of having gotten pregnant and giving birth to Carrie. She also constantly reminds Carrie of the fact that their bodies are dirty and disgusting, and she should cover herself up and be ashamed. And just kind of, you know, jumping ahead a little bit, but the sheer fact of Carrie going to prom and making herself a dress that fits her seems like such a massive rebellion against her mother.
Right. I want to ask you, because you so you've read the book, and one of the things that I haven't read Carrie, but I know that the book is very different in terms of her physicality. She is meant to be she's meant to be basically fat and not attractive. And in the film, she's played by Sissy Spacek, who is, you know, Sissy Spacek is a very thin woman. It's, you know, Sissy Spacek, I guess, in this film is meant to be like Hollywood ugly. Like, she's never unattractive. But the thing about Carrie in the book was like, she, you know, she had all of these pimples and stuff like that. I wonder how you see that change from book to screen, and like, what do you make of it?
Well, you kind of mentioned it yourself. It's the idea of no one in Hollywood is allowed to be ugly on screen.
Right.
No one in Hollywood is allowed to be plain on screen. So you're right. In the book, Carrie is, you know, she's a plain girl. She's just, there's so many reasons that people can latch onto and bully her in school, which they do. Right. And kind of here, because obviously this is the 70s Hollywood, and then in every subsequent adaptation of Carrie, really, if we look at all of them, you know, the Kimberly Pierce one, the short-lived TV series, even Carrie 2, you know, The Rage, they're all perfectly, like, Hollywood actress level, good-looking young women.
Yeah.
There's nothing kind of that would make them stand out necessarily. Sissy Spacek, I think, is really interesting because I think she goes to places, I think, with the way that she performs with her body that makes her shift on screen. Like, if you see her in Badlands and if you see her in this film, she has a very different physicality about her, but she is essentially, you know, very slim, white, blonde, blue-eyed Hollywood actress. There's nothing about her that's unconventional.
Right.
There is something about the way that she sort of contorts her body.
Mm-hmm.
And I think even in the shower scene, you know, when she goes from sort of caressing herself and be looking almost like it's a masturbation scene in a softcore porn film,
right,
to being almost like a gremlin-esque type figure that's hunching in on herself and bleeding and kind of touching everything around her and covering it in blood as well. And she's so distraught by it. She kind of holds nothing back, which is, I think, one of the things that she really brings to the film.
Yeah.
The fact that she's not worried about looking Hollywood pretty all the time on screen.
Yeah.
What do you think about her?
I love Sissy Spacek. Let me tell you, Sissy Spacek is one of my favorite white ladies, and I hope that she doesn't mess up because I love her. She's I first saw her as a kid in this film called The Coal Miner's Daughter. It's a Loretta Lynn biopic.
Yes.
And yes, it's a Southern classic. And she's incredible. You're totally right. Like, she's a really physical actress as well. And I think it's also important to, you know, situate this film, in her filmography, because you're right, she does Badlands like 2 or 3 years before Carrie, and she gets a nomination. I think maybe she got a nomination for Badlands. I can't remember, but I think she gets her first Oscar nomination for Carrie, and then I'm pretty sure that it's like right after Carrie, she wins for The Coal Miner's Daughter. So she immediately like establishes herself as not just like a versatile actress, even though she has a very distinctive voice, but quite a serious actress in a horror film. I mean, I don't know, Brian De Palma films, as far as I know, now I'm generalizing, I'm saying this, and maybe you will challenge me with facts, but his films are not generally Oscar bait, are they?
No, I think you're totally right. And it's interesting that you bring it up, because this is a conversation that we've been having for like the past, 2-3 years, about horror films infiltrating the mainstream kind of art house respectability, getting nominations and awards for screenplays, for performances. And the kind of people forget that Carrie, also, the fact that she got nominated for Best Actress is kind of astounding, because this is on, especially if we go back 40 odd years, this is not a genre that is the beacon of respectability. This is, exploitation and box office. This will make money, but it won't give you gravitas as a performer, or necessarily as a director.
Right.
But I think De Palma, one of the things I always loved about him is the fact that he kind of, I might be wrong and I might be just projecting this onto his career, but he always struck me as a guy who would make the films that he wanted to make, or would scam his way into making the film that he actually wanted to make.
Yes, absolutely.
Because like the films that he'd made before were Sisters, Phantom of the Paradise, which I adore and is one of the weirdest fucking films that has ever been made, and Obsession.
Yeah.
This is probably kind of his biggest film, I think, at that point.
To be clear, but we don't want to use the Oscars as a barometer of any sort of value, but they are a body that has presented themselves as prestige and or is conferring prestige rather. But Piper Laurie is also nominated. This is a film that really, like, the performances in this film are really taken seriously. And on that note, I do wonder, how do you feel about Piper Laurie's performance in retrospect? Because there are moments of it that are just quite frightening, but also really camp, obviously.
Yeah. I found it more frightening this time round. I think I always found her like as a frightening figure, because she is just, the campiness when I watched it early on always kind of went over my head, and she just seems very grotesque and scary. And the fact that she was wearing kind of that white nightgown stuck in my head. And this time round, I found her devotion to, her religious mania to be the scariest thing. And more than before, I found the way that she hated her femininity and she hated her body, and by extension she hated her daughter's body, and was constantly kind of punishing both of them. Really, really scary. I mean, it is a kind of a hammy, over the top performance, but I have a soft spot for those. I mean, I'm a really big fan of Joan Crawford. Like, I have a really big soft spot for them.
Yeah, I think that, the scene where Carrie comes home from prom, having unwittingly killed her classmates, the scene where she's monologuing about her disgust for her husband and what he smelled like, and then that little, transition where she says, but I liked it. Like, I liked the way that he touched me. It's a really, to me, I found, like, you know, the first time I saw it, which that was, so yeah, it must have been 5 or 6 years ago, whenever we did that panel, I found her, like, insanely creepy and frightening. And this time I just found her so sad. I was really like, you know, here, this is a woman who you think for most of the film as well. So it's a really, I think, nuanced portrayal, because for most of the film you think like, oh, she doesn't enjoy sex, like she doesn't, you know, understand it, like she feels that her body compromises her moral devotion to God. But actually it's something much more sinister than that. It's like she herself is sort of split herself between her nature, what's natural, what feels good, like and I think what she hopes to sort of extend to Carrie, or at least pass down to Carrie, her feelings about motherhood seem to be extremely opposed. Like she clearly like doesn't enjoy it. She finds her daughter to be this extremely treacherous, almost frightening alien creature, even before she finds out that Carrie has telekinesis, before she decides that she's a witch and she needs to be vanquished. It's very clear that her relationship with her daughter is extremely antagonistic, and that there's no real nurturing there. But I think the thing that struck me about this character, and also Laura's performance, is that it becomes really sinister. It's just somebody who is filled with self-loathing, and yeah, that's really somber.
Because of the way that we're taught to perceive mothers, and the way that we're taught to expect mothers to behave, and this kind of generalized idea that a woman is by default nurturing and motherly.
Right.
The image of seeing Carrie's mother be so filled with hate and self-loathing, and also disgust for her daughter as well, and just be the radical opposite of what we're taught to expect a mother to be. I think also the film really taps into that that sort of general societal expectation of what we think mothers should look and behave like.
Right. Because the conclusion of their relationship is very sexualized as well. Like, this is I mean, I guess I would argue, like, a lot, if not most, horror films are sort of premised on this kind of pre-Oedipal conflict. Especially when it comes to slashers, it's always like, yes, the character had an extremely demented relationship with his mother, and mother figures are extremely powerful in this genre. And the thing that is extremely disturbing about the end of Carrie is, like, you know, and this has been over theorized, is, you know, the stabbing of the mother. She ends up being crucified, like the little statue of Christ that Carrie has in her bedroom, I think, or maybe it's in their cupboard. But you know, it's very phallic, like it's very sexualized. She talks to her daughter about enjoying sex with her father and hating herself for it, essentially, and then she stabs her daughter in the back. And she comes down the stairs laughing in a scene that is absolutely nightmarish. It's not, and I think, like, yeah, there's something about that is really fascinating. Essentially, all of the conflict in the film takes place between women. Men are not really a part of this, you know, violence, which I think is really interesting.
No, men are total pawns, and I wonder as well if this emphasizing the really intense toxic dynamic between Carrie and her mother is also another way of Carrie being in conversation with Psycho, which is a film also all about mommy issues.
Yes.
We've spoken a lot about kind of the adults in the film. What do you make of the teenagers?
Well, let me give you some context to this. It was extremely fortuitous, actually, that you asked me to talk about Carrie, because I was already thinking about it a lot. I was in the middle of writing a review of this upcoming film, which I don't know if you've seen, but if you haven't, it's amazing. I think it's right up your alley. But it's a film called Saint Maud.
Yes, I've seen it.
Of course you have. Of course you have. I love it. I love this film, and so hopefully by the time this comes out, my review will have been published. But yeah, so I was already thinking about Carrie and about the body and well, specifically the female body in horror. And the other thing that just sort of struck me this time around was, you know, I mean, we're talking about the body, but I think it's also really important to emphasize that these are like white women's bodies. And one of the things that's happening in the film is these white women are sort of creating categories of otherness within their community, because it's a very homogenous group of girls, and they're all pretty well off and middle class. I mean, I think we're meant to get the impression that Carrie is lower middle class. She's not quite poor. They live in like a very massive house, but maybe they inherited it. These distinctions between them that they're creating are very mob-like. Like the way that they turn on Carrie and throw tampons at her is extremely sort of reflective of a kind of mob violence. To me, it's sort of, it becomes a really interesting film about race. It's fascinating because a lot of times, I mean, I'm a Black woman, so I quite often get asked to write about race, and that what that means is that I'm writing about Black people, or I'm writing about films about Black people. But Carrie is also a film about race. It's a film about white people. And it is, you know, one of these projects that ends up, and I don't think that this is something that Brian De Palma like actually set out to do, but it ends up being very emblematic of a particular milieu. I just don't think that he approached this project thinking that he was trying to say anything, especially the way that horror films nowadays get sort of tapped as being like, I'm saying this in quotations, but elevated horror is having some sort of like social realism. I really think that this is a movie that is essentially about the ways in which white people create others. Like, she's other, right? Like she has a really distinct Southern accent. I find that aspect of the film pretty fascinating.
That's so interesting. I never thought about it like that, but you're right. I mean, the film is about otherness. It's just otherness in the context of high school politics, which usually manifests itself as bullying. And it's how they define or pick Carrie as the other, because on the surface, and like we were talking about before, there's nothing about her that makes her different from the rest of the skinny, pretty white girls that are in her school. There's literally nothing that would set her apart. She lives next door to some of them. They look almost exactly alike, but there is that something element about her that makes her different and makes them latch onto her. And even that scene that I was mentioning before with Coach Collins, where she is sort of talking about the fact that Carrie sort of attracts, what's the word I'm looking for?
Violence.
Or she attracts violence, yeah. What do you think that says, though, about Carrie being positioned as the monster of the film? You know, you talked about her kind of being, you know, she's got telekinesis. That's the basics of it. But it's all wrapped up in religious iconography. There's always the element of, you know, witchery. And then she kind of becomes unhinged in the prom scene.
Yeah.
She's often mentioned kind of in conversations or articles about the female monstrous. So what do you think kind of all of this othering of Carrie, but also everything we've spoken about so far kind of builds her up into being a monster?
Well, I mean, the thing about creating otherness or racism or any sort of prejudice is that it sort of threatens a symbolic order, right? Like, it makes your privileges precarious and tenuous. And so you have to sort of reify those boundaries. And I think the thing about Carrie, and this is something I also think that De Palma probably, maybe I just don't want to give him a lot of credit. That's me being grudging again. You know, he ends up pointing out that actually Carrie brings out, or what she symbolizes is a kind of monstrosity in all of them. they all menstruate, right? They're all, these are all young women who I hate to say it like this, but it's because I'm going to make this point, but they are of procreating age or whatever, it's like their possibility within them, and that sexual difference is sort of what a lot of horror films have been sort of predicated on. And I think with Carrie, she exposes that almost in a really literal way, right? Like, those other girls obviously are menstruating, but they throw their tampons at Carrie because Carrie's never she doesn't know what a period is. Her mother's never explained this to her, so she sort of visualizes that, right? Like this thing that is kept hidden for most girls. Most girls don't, I mean, obviously girls talk about their periods, but I don't know if I'm being as articulate as I want to be about this, but these are things that like are kept subterranean. So girls are very much encouraged not to talk about their periods because, that's something that, men don't want to hear about or whatever. It's something that we have to keep to ourselves or internalize. And so Carrie externalizes that. It's also like, it's crazy how Chris in particular, because I think there's a way that she and Carrie double each other, where Carrie is extremely shy and I guess chaste, or Chris is over sexualized and explicitly feminine. And I think there's an interesting connection between the way that you see Carrie learning about the way to perform as a woman that Chris is almost always doing. Chris, we should say, also was played by Nancy Allen, who is Brian De Palma's wife at this time. But, yeah, she, there's a scene where Chris is like putting on makeup, and essentially the only thing she's getting ready to do is like, give John Travolta a blowjob so that she can tell him that, she wants him to participate in the scheme that she's dreamed up about getting back at Carrie. And then Coach Collins showing Carrie that she can be pretty and telling her like, oh, this is how you fit in. This is how you have to sort of navigate this milieu, is by, essentially being a woman in this film it's a performance. I think that Carrie has the way that she is sort of literalized as other because she has these magical powers really sort of indicates that a lot of what is fearsome about women or meant to be fearsome about women is sort of like it's all inextricably bound up in their bodies and because I mean, as we were saying before, like the thing that sort of precipitates all of this is that she gets her first menstrual cycle. So it's not even like the telekinesis becomes this really like fantastic embodiment of this thing that all women really are expected to have. Not in the sense that like all women are expected to have magical powers, but that, like what happens when a woman is able to procreate. This is the thing that is just on a psychological level for horror, like really fertile ground. No pun intended.
No. Oh, it was totally intended. Come on. No, but you're so right. And there's kind of an interesting semi subgenre, or kind of a quite a few horror films that sort of use the moment of a girl or a young woman getting her period, kind of equating the menstrual cycle with sort of a curse, and they call it the curse in this film as well. And here it literally manifests as magical or supernatural abilities in Carrie, but they're never kind of positioned as a power. They're positioned as a curse. It's something that will and eventually destroys her.
Yeah.
But picking up on your point about Chris, though, I thought it was so fascinating the way you were talking about it, because Carrie is the monster of the film, but Chris is the villain. She's the one that actually puts a lot of the terrible shit that's put upon Carrie and that leads her to breaking point in motion. And you're right, she's her complete opposite in kind of every single trait. She performs this version of hyperfemininity. She is extremely aggressive. She also kind of challenges, she has the kind of the opposite relationship with Coach Collins, also gets slapped by her, by the way, but in a completely different context.
Hmm.
And then, she uses sex as a tool to get John Travolta to partake in her scheme. And there's such glee in her kind of humiliating and hurting Carrie. She's such a nasty character, and not a single other person in that whole high school, in that whole environment, can stop her or even see what's happening with her. So in a way, they're kind of going through completely parallel journeys.
Mm. John Travolta, I can't remember what his character's name is, where he's like chopping, like he's hitting the pigs with an axe, and she's like encouraging him,
Yeah.
and there's like this bloodthirst in her eyes.
Yeah. And she like asks to be the one to pull the rope. Or no, he like offers it to her, and she responds with something like really mean spirited, like, "Oh no, I was always going to be the one to pull the rope to let the
Yeah.
pig's blood fall on Carrie."
Yeah.
Yeah, she's a vicious little character, and I don't think she gets as much attention because the film is filled with, with Carrie and with Carrie's mother, and they're much more flamboyant. But Chris is really nasty.
Yeah, she's horrible. She's a real she's sort of almost like this patriarchal or misogynistic um nightmare of a woman come to life, right? Because she is, as you say, you're absolutely right. Like, she's hyper feminized. She is, sexually confident. And the thing is that even though she embodies all of these really awful characteristics, she gets hit so many times. Like, John Travolta hits her, Coach Collins hits her. Coach Collins absolutely needs to be fired. I think that Coach Collins is also a low-key villain.
Yeah.
Hitting these children, that's not that's not okay. I don't know.
It's the 70s.
Exactly. I was just like, Coach Collins definitely believes in corporal punishment, and she's really not that far off from. But yeah, Chris is it's amazing, right? Because there is also something really phallic about her assault on Carrie, because there is that sort of double entendre when she's talking to John Travolta about pulling the rope, right? And we've already seen that their strategy, or the way that she gets him to do the things that she wants to do, is through sex. So there's a kind of sexual undertone to that exchange that they have. And then, it's the inverse of the first scene, or the first sequence, where Carrie is bleeding. The blood is poured onto her. So yeah, this film is like constantly negotiating all of these different sexual boundaries. I guess I should say like sexual transgressions that end up being really fascinating, especially when you think of the fact that, I mean, this is film, we set this already, but, Carrie does get a really bad rep as being a very misogynist film. So this is the thing, like, these texts are really complex, and it's impossible to dismiss this film because it is so rich in that way.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. That's why I also mentioned that De Palma is a problematic fave of mine.
Yeah.
But I wanted to talk a bit more about the prom massacre scene, because that's arguably one of the most iconic scenes of the film, and it's so interestingly filmed. And I wanted to dig into a little bit of that, because there's a lot of stylistic choices there that are very showy. And De Palma is very showy as a filmmaker. He likes the artifice of film. He loves the split screen. He loves the slow motion. They spend a lot of time building up to the prom. They're getting ready, everyone, including supporting tertiary characters you don't even know the names of, kind of going out, getting their tuxes, getting ready, making their dress, buying lipstick. It's all very it's all very sweet. But then when they get to the actual prom, and it's this kind of Carrie and Tommy getting comfortable, and Carrie kind of starting to ease into high school life, which is so alien to her. And when we actually see the machinations, the pig's blood thing happening when they start going up onto the stage. It's all slowed down. And then when it happens, it also takes such a long time. It almost as if we're being asked to revel in the humiliation of Carrie. So what do you think of that particular scene and how it's filmed?
I think you're absolutely right. Like, it's really prolonged, right? You have the split screen, you're sort of dwelling in this moment of Carrie's degradation. You have this moment where you are seeing what people in the crowd are really feeling, which is sort of stunned and shocked and confused. And then you have another moment where you're sort of in her head, and what you see what she sees, which is people laughing at her. Her mother's forewarning has come true, basically.
Yeah.
And then you see the way that people die. Like, you see Miss Collins die. You see the teacher who had picked on her earlier in class, the way that he dies. You see the kids try to get Tommy to safety. It's a different scene. It plays really differently in this particular climate, because I think, it is it really resembles a lot of films now about school shootings. And this is a period of time, like, this is, it's 1976. I hate this idea of just like, oh yeah, it was an innocent time. Like, I mean, obviously horrible things are happening at this time too. There are a lot of, for true crime buffs, there are a lot of serial killers out there around this time. But I think one of the things that is truly, I think that I found like really enduring about this scene is that, you are really encouraged or invited to sort of sit in this massacre in a way that almost feels, I mean, it's horror. So you have to sort of, you're watching all of these people that you have gotten to know in some way. So they've become real people. They become fleshed out dimensional figures. You're watching them die, and you're watching them die in a really horrible way. At the same time, you're also sort of, it becomes really rich because you are sympathetic to Carrie, and that Miss Collins technically is innocent. Like, she wasn't laughing, but Carrie is unable to control her powers. It's a chilling scene even to this day. I mean, we were talking about how sometimes the Brian De Palma's filming techniques are extremely garish, or maybe a better word is like they're, as you were saying, they're very showy. But actually this doesn't feel dated at all. It feels, as you say, like really deliberate, really meticulous. And it's still a really frightening scene. Like, I mean, just watching it last night, it's horrifying. And I remember thinking also this time around that it actually wasn't as long as I thought it was the first time I saw it. Like, the first time I saw it, I thought it went on forever. But this time, it's actually like, it's not, Carrie kills the people in the gym. Then she kills Nancy Allen's character, what's her name? Chris, and John Travolta's character as she's walking home. And then she's home. It doesn't actually take that long. It just feels like that because of, the violence that's happening in that scene. And you see, I mean, like, it's easy to see why it became such an iconic sequence.
I completely agree with you. When I was rewatching it just today, I remembered the scene really well in my head, but it definitely felt shorter than I remember it.
Yeah.
And I think part of that has to do with the way that scene in particular has become so iconic and has been used so much, even to, re-release, re-promote, reposition, or just pay tribute to the film.
Yeah.
It's always that prom scene. It's the figure of Carrie completely disassociated from herself and in a completely unhinged state and covered in blood. And that kind of makes it feel like that is the whole purpose and almost the climax of the movie, when it actually isn't. The climax of the film is Carrie's confrontation with her mother,
right,
and the destruction of their house, which I also had kind of, for some reason, misplaced in my head as something that came before the prom scene. So I'd forgotten that there was a double ending. The scene feels much longer than it actually is because it is so horrific. And I think partly because of the split screen as well,
Yeah.
because we're seeing a lot of things happening at the same time. And it's interesting to think about it now because we're so used to second screening, to double screening things, to be watching something and having one or two or three additional screens open up in front of us and us interacting with them in some way. And but it's still, even thinking about this kind of in the 70s, or trying to think about how it could have been perceived at that time by those audiences. It's a lot of information that's being given to us very quickly, and all of that information, all of that imagery is amazingly violent. You know, it's people being killed, but we're also seeing the killer's point of view at the same time as we're seeing the murders. It's still really super effective, I think.
Yeah. It's completely effective. And then, you're right. You think that you're at the climax of the film and then the action is about to happen again. It's interesting because she goes home and she washes and she puts on a nice nightgown and she wants to be held by her mother after this horrific act. And I mean, the thing that is just like overpowering about that scene is like she's like essentially crying to her mother to hold her. And also there's like all these candles in the house. And it looks very much like a scene of sacrifice. I mean, I guess I'm just thinking about like the last film that we
Yes.
where it was very much like dynamic where there were loads of candles and somebody was being sacrificed. And yeah,
Listen, I did not expect a through line to be drawn between Carrie and the Skeleton Key, but only you could do that. I thank you.
It does, but it looks like I guess I was thinking about that because of the way that her mother is so steeped in religion, and she clearly feels like she has to. This is the only way. Like she has to kill her daughter. Because of the religious iconography, just really beckons all these different stories from the Bible where it is, because I think of the way that blood is so positioned in this film where she's like drenched in it and they're killing pigs. And so, that scene really stuck out to me that, she's committed this like really awful thing. Who knows how aware she is of what she has just done? That's not made clear in the film. And then she comes home and she essentially dies with her mother in her arms in a really womb-like, well, maybe her mom is actually in like a womb-like position where she's sort of like curled up in Carrie's chest.
Well, it's very reminiscent. It's also religious iconography. It's literally the pose of La Pietà, which is kind of that image of the corpse of Christ in the lap of his mother. So it's the reversal. Instead of the dead child being held by his parent, it's the child holding her dead parent.
Yes. Yeah.
I wanted to ask you kind of about the final scene. I think it's really interesting that the film doesn't even end there, which is quite a Hollywood climax, big massacre, house comes down, the monster dies, the crazy mother dies, we're all good. But then there's another scene, and it's sort of the aftermath. And I found that scene really drills down the theme of trauma that lives throughout the film. What do you make of that scene and how the film explores trauma throughout?
I mean, this is Sue is poor Sue. She's played by Amy Irving. She goes on to star in my favorite Brian De Palma film, which is The Fury. And I think The Fury is a little after this. It might be Amy Irving, interestingly enough, is playing somebody who has telekinesis.
It's directly after Carrie.
Yes. Okay. Yeah. So, I mean, one of the things that really makes sense to me about this film is, that sort of like adolescent feeling of feeling like your body is out of your control. And for the way that Sue sort of really grounds the film in that, for me, is like, Carrie she becomes almost mythical, right? She becomes really folkloric. I mean, her mom's on the phone. She's talking about like how all of these news reporters have talked or have like descended on the town and then left or whatever. And for Sue, it's just a nightmare. Like, she's maybe, never ever going to, and it's that scene as well is like truly horrifying. I still jumped last night, and it's like a really classic jump scare, but like that trauma is never going to let her go. Like, it's just inextricable. It's a part of her now. She comes to the gym to sort of see her, her good act visualized, and then she ends up witnessing a massacre. She ends up witnessing the death of all of her friends and her boyfriend. And I think that it's a perfect ending. I'm almost glad, because you're right. Like, the typical Hollywood ending would be to end it with Carrie and her mother sort of buried, and it's as if they never existed again, right? Like, you can sort of you can see that as a very neat, clean ending, and this horrible thing happened to this town. But actually what Sue does is really, reifies the fact that this is those sort of things don't ever leave you. Those things that trauma it becomes very much a part of your life and your psyche, and they're not going to be able to move on without having that part of their history. And yeah, I think it's a perfect ending. And Amy Irving's great in this. She doesn't have a lot to do except sort of like smirk, but I think she's very cool in this. I love her hair in this film. But yeah, no, I think that's it. It's a really brilliant ending, because it really sort of connects those themes of trauma and girlhood and really cements this theme, this really complicated or maybe even this really contradictory theme that, to be in a woman's body is traumatic and inescapable. But you're also invited to sympathize with them. So,
and also powerful.
Yeah.
I couldn't agree with you more. I love the ending.
I guess I was wondering, like, of the Stephen King monstrous woman, because there are a lot of monstrous women in Stephen King's film, or his adaptations rather. Like, is this high up there? What are your favorites?
Oh my God, that is such a good question. Can I ask you that? You're the guest. Can I ask you that?
Yeah, my favorite is Dolores Claiborne.
Oh, come on. Dolores is not a villain.
She's not a villain, but I do think that that's another film that is doing similar things, right? But I think in a much more, if we're going to call these things, I mean, like, it's much more feminist, right? It's much more dimensional, because the line in that film is like, sometimes being a bitch is all a woman has to hold on to, and it's about these murderous women.
Yes, it's a mantra.
Who end up, but they have to do these murderous acts in order to survive. Like, I love Doris Claiborne is first of all, if you haven't seen it, it's an incredible film. Maybe I would argue the best Stephen King adaptation.
Oh,
do you? I stand by it. What's yours?
I mean, we both love Dolores Claiborne.
Yes.
I love it. Deeply underrated film. Everybody should check it out.
Yeah.
I wouldn't say it's the best Stephen King adaptation.
What's the best?
Oh, that's a whole nother episode. That's a whole nother 2 hours of us arguing about Stephen King adaptations. But going back to the murderous or villainous women in the films based on Stephen King books, one of my favorites, if not my favorite, has to be Misery.
Oh, yeah.
Which is also, Kathy Bates, who's also the protagonist of Dolores Claiborne. And she's an amazing actress. I love Kathy Bates. And Misery, I've also read the book and I've seen the film so many times. It's also so extremely relevant right now, I think, and also just taps into the idea of toxic fandom and the relationship between artist and an audience that I'm really intrigued by. And also it's Annie Wilkes is so interesting as a villain because she is unhinged. She's not supernatural,
Yeah.
but she lives in a world where she has created rules, but her rules seem to bend morally in order to allow her to perform acts of violence and murder. And actually, the more you learn about her, the more horrific she becomes. So it's both a book and a film that really benefits from rereading and rewatching, because once you know her entire story or more about her, she becomes even more horrifying. And I love that about her. Whereas Carrie is someone who struggles to understand or comprehend herself and then loses it and is consumed by that moment, whereas Annie knows herself quite well, and I find that really chilling.
Yeah, Carrie, there's a lot of horror is acted upon Carrie before she actually has this
Yeah,
outburst. And so she's just she emerges as a much more tragic figure than anything else.
totally. Yeah, I agree. Just to wrap up the conversation, what do you think is the legacy of Carrie on horror today?
That's a very good question. Obviously the iconography of Carrie has survived, and so many filmmakers have referenced it since. It's fascinating that Brian De Palma, because this is what you were saying earlier, he's so influenced by Hitchcock, and he loves a good shower scene. And yeah, in the same way, I think Carrie has become a real touchstone for a lot of other filmmakers. I mean, it's been remade. I think it's interesting as well that you mentioned the Carrie sequels, but you did not mention the Carrie remake with Chloe Moretz that was directed by...
Oh, no, I
Oh, did
did.
you? Okay, I missed it.
Yeah, the Kimberly Pierce.
Yes. Yeah, which is, it's a shame because it's a film that is directed by a woman. Kimberly Pierce did Boys Don't Cry, didn't she? Am I making that up?
No, you're absolutely right.
Yeah.
She did.
And so, yeah, you'd think that would like add some level of richness to it, but it just doesn't. But yeah, I don't know. I think that horror has always been a really, it's to me a woman's film. I know, like, obviously it has all of this, the fabric of the genre is very misogynistic, it's very racialized, and it's a really complicated genre, but it is ultimately a a a form that has been really animated by the fear of women, and also ends up saying really complex and fascinating things about the experience of women, even, well, I should say, despite a lot of filmmakers. And yeah, as I was saying earlier, I think this film that is getting ready to come out, Saint Maud, takes a lot of cues from this film, in the way that it thinks about how women absorb their own genderedness, and I want to be like careful about this, women who I identify as women, and how they are essentially in this is something that happens in Saint Maud. I want to be very careful that I don't spoil it, but the ways in which women punish themselves and punish their bodies, and that becomes a really fascinating through line in this new film that I think is absolutely an influence of a film like Carrie. And yeah, I think it just is, it sort of really defined, or begins to sort of define Brian De Palma's career. I mean, obviously, as you're saying, like, he did Scarface, and he would do later Obsession. He does this film Passion. I mean, his latest films aren't that great. But yeah, Carrie is still the film that is talked about with a lot of reverence, even though I think it's a really complicated text. And I think people acknowledge that.
I think you're absolutely correct. And will you come back and talk about Saint Maud with me?
Yes, of course.
Kelly, thank you so much for your time and for your always super intelligent insight.
Thank you.
Where can people find out more about your work?
I suppose you can find me on Twitter. I'm at Kelly, which is spelled Kelli, Weston. So you can find my work there. You can find me on Movie Notebook. I've written for a film comment. And I'm just around, just doing this and that, bits and bobs.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.